Imagine this: the Champ de Mars fairgrounds on the outskirts of Paris, summer of 1815, when the air hangs thick with the smell of roasting chestnuts, animal dung, and unwashed bodies pressed too close together. The carnival has set up its tents in the shadow of the École Militaire, a sprawling chaos of brightly painted wagons, striped canvas pavilions, and wooden platforms where performers call out to passing crowds in voices hoarse from shouting the same promises. Hour after hour, day after day, season after season, until the words lose all meaning, except as incantation, as ritual designed to separate coins from pockets. The hour approaches 8 in the evening, when the July sun hangs low and amber over the Seine, when the heat of the day has broken but the cool of night has not yet arrived, when the space between feels suspended, uncertain, caught in transition between states. Gas lamps are being lit along the carnival's main thoroughfare, their flames casting pools of yellow light that don't quite connect, leaving gaps of shadow where anything might hide, where the ordinary and the strange exist in uncomfortable proximity. We focus on one tent in particular, smaller than the others, set apart from the main avenue, where the acrobats tumble and the fire-eaters breathe flame, and the fortune-tellers promise futures they cannot possibly know. The canvas is faded burgundy, patched in places where weather and time have worn holes through the fabric, the repairs visible as darker squares against lighter background, like scars marking old wounds. Above the entrance, a hand-painted sign in letters that were once gold but have weathered to the colour of old brass, the kind of yellow-brown that suggests decay rather than value. The wild man of the Pyrenees, see nature's most fearsome creation. 1 franc admission. Inside, the tent is dim despite the late-day sun outside, despite the summer light that should penetrate canvas this thin. Oil lamps burn in iron sconces, 4 of them positioned at corners, casting pools of amber warmth that somehow make the shadows between them feel darker, more substantial, more present than mere absence of light should feel. The air is close, stifling, carrying the smell of lamp oil and something else beneath it, something organic and sour that comes from too many bodies confined in too small a space, for too long without proper ventilation, without the mercy of fresh air or open windows. Wooden benches arranged in a half circle face a platform, raised 3 feet off the ground. The benches are rough-hewn, splinter-prone, the kind of seating that suggests the comfort of the audience is secondary to the economics of fitting as many bodies as possible into limited space. On that platform, centered precisely so that every angle offers clear view, a cage, iron bars, the kind used for dangerous animals, for lions and bears and things that might kill if given opportunity, the kind that suggests whatever lives inside cannot be trusted to remain docile, cannot be allowed freedom even in this controlled environment, where escape would be difficult, if not impossible. The cage is perhaps 8 feet square, not large enough for a grown man to fully stand, if that man were tall, not wide enough to lie down completely, if that man were broad-shouldered, just enough space to exist, to be displayed, to perform the essential function of being seen without the dignity of having space to be private, to hide, to claim any territory as belonging to self rather than to spectacle. And inside that cage, sitting on a wooden stool with his massive hands resting on his knees, his head bowed as if in prayer or exhaustion or simple resignation to what comes next, what always comes next, what has come next for 5 years, and will continue coming until something breaks or someone intervenes, or death provides the only escape that doesn't require running. Maurice Tillet, describe him not with clinical detachment, but with the shock of first sight, the visceral reaction that audiences experience when they pay their franc and push through the tent flap, expecting spectacle and finding something that makes their breath catch in their throats, that makes their skin prickle with reactions they cannot name, that touches something primal in the human brain, that recognizes deviation from expected patterns and responds with fear, with fascination, with the uneasy awareness that the boundary between human and other is thinner than we like to believe. A man. Unmistakably a man, despite what the carnival barker outside has promised about monsters and wild things and nature's fearsome creations. But a man whose face and body have been transformed by some force that seems to have reshaped bone and flesh into configurations that the human eye struggles to process as human, that creates cognitive dissonance between what the brain expects faces to look like and what this particular face presents. His head is enormous, disproportionate to his shoulders, though his shoulders themselves are massive, sloped with muscle that suggests terrible strength, the kind of physical power that could break things, could damage, could destroy, if applied without restraint. His face, the bones of his brow ridge, push forward, creating a shelf of bone that throws his eyes into shadow, that makes it difficult to see his expression clearly from certain angles, that gives his face a quality of permanent aggression, even in repose. His jaw juts forward, the lower teeth visible, even when his mouth is closed, creating an underbite that transforms what might have been a normal face into something that seems to belong to an earlier stage of human evolution, to species that existed before modern humans refined their features into the proportions we now consider normal, consider beautiful, consider acceptable. But his eyes, describe his eyes here with care, with attention to the humanity that lives in them, despite everything else, with recognition that eyes are where we read emotion, where we recognize consciousness, where we see reflected back our own capacity for thought and feeling and all the qualities that make us more than meat and bone. His eyes carry something else entirely, not aggression, something quieter, something that might be sadness or might be a kind of patient endurance that comes from years of being looked at this way, years of seeing shock and revulsion and fascinated horror in the faces of strangers who have paid money for the privilege of staring, who believe their franc entitles them to gawk without guilt, to consume his appearance as entertainment without having to confront the humanity of the person being consumed. His hands, resting on his knees, are so large that a normal man's hand would disappear inside his grip, would be swallowed completely by fingers thick as walking sticks, by palms broad enough to palm a man's head like a child palms an apple, knuckles swollen to the size of walnuts, veins visible beneath skin that seems stretched too tight over bones that have grown too large. But the way he holds them, gentle, careful, positioned as if he's afraid his own strength might damage something if he's not constantly vigilant about control, constantly aware that his body possesses power that could harm without intention, that could break without meaning to break. This is not the story you were told about Shrek. This is the story of Maurice Tillet, the man whose face became a fairy tale, and whose life became a warning about what happens when the world decides you are a monster before you've had the chance to prove you are human. Maurice sits in his cage and waits for the crowd to arrive. He has learned the rhythms of this performance, learned them through repetition that has carved grooves in his consciousness the way water carves grooves in stone, through patient, relentless erosion of dignity that happens so gradually you don't notice until one day you look at what remains and realize most of what you were is gone. The barker outside will gather a crowd with promises of horror and spectacle. The tent will fill with bodies, with whispers, with the rustle of fabric as people press forward for better views, as they jostle for position, as they claim their space in the hierarchy of observation. And then the barker will enter, will gesture toward the cage with theatrical flourish, and we'll begin the story that is not Maurice's story at all, but the story the audience is paid to hear. The story that transforms a man with a medical condition into a wild thing captured from mountains, a monster tamed and brought to civilization for the edification and entertainment of those fortunate enough to possess normal faces, normal bodies, normal lives. But before that happens, in this moment of quiet before the performance begins, Maurice closes his eyes and remembers a different life. A life before the cage, a life when his face was his own and his body was his own, and the future stretched ahead of him, filled with possibilities that did not include being displayed like an animal in a traveling carnival, that did not include having strangers pay money to stare at his face, that did not include the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who see only the surface, who never look deep enough to recognize that the monster they've paid to see is actually a man who reads Voltaire, who speaks 4 languages fluently, who dreams in poetry and thinks in philosophy and suffers in silence, because silence is the only response that maintains dignity when the alternative is screaming at an audience that will never understand, will never care, will never see past what their eyes show them to recognize what their hearts might teach them if they were willing to learn. How does a brilliant young man with dreams of law and literature and love end up in a cage being called a monster? And how does his tragedy become, decades later, a beloved children's film about an ogre who just wants to be left alone? To understand how Maurice Tillet became Shrek, we need to go back 23 years, to a small town in the Ural Mountains where a perfectly ordinary child was born into a perfectly ordinary family, unaware that his body carried within it a transformation that would make him famous, feared, and ultimately forgotten by everyone except the man who would turn his tragedy into a fairy tale. Maurice Tillet is 11 years old. The year is 1903. The scene is winter, deep Russian winter when darkness comes at 3 in the afternoon and the windows frost over with ice patterns that look like ferns and forests, like nature's own artwork painted in crystals that melt and reform each night, each morning, each cycle of temperature creating new designs that exist only briefly before warmth or cold destroys them. The Tillet family home is small but comfortable, a 2-story wooden house on a quiet street in Ekaterinburg, where successful merchants and minor bureaucrats raise their families in the kind of neighborhood where children attend good schools and parents have reasonable expectations for their children's futures, where the boundaries between social classes are clear but not insurmountable, where hard work and intelligence might elevate a family from comfortable to prosperous over the course of a generation. Inside the parlor, a fire burning in the ceramic, tile stove that heats the room, the tiles painted in traditional patterns of blue and white that catch the firelight and reflect it back in ways that make the whole room feel warmer than temperature alone would justify. Gas lamps turned up against the early darkness, their mantles glowing with that particular quality of gaslight that electricity will later replace but never quite duplicate, that softness, that warmth, that slight flicker that makes everything seem alive, seem breathing, and at the writing desk positioned to catch the last of the afternoon light from the window. Young Maurice, bent over a stack of books, his pen moving across the page with the focused intensity of a child who has discovered that reading offers escape, adventure, knowledge, power that the physical world cannot provide, that exists independent of body, of circumstance, of the material conditions that constrain ordinary life. He is beautiful, not in an exceptional way, not in a way that would make strangers stop and comment, not in the way that suggests future as a performer or model, or anyone whose appearance becomes their primary asset, but in the ordinary way that healthy children are beautiful, the way that suggests everything is working as it should, the way that promises normal development, normal life, normal future unmarked by physical catastrophe or genetic accident. Clear skin, the kind that has never known serious illness or malnutrition. Bright eyes that focus easily, that track movement without difficulty, that suggest good vision and better attention. Hair that his mother cuts herself every month with careful attention to keeping it neat and presentable, dark brown and thick, falling across his forehead when he bends over his books, when he loses himself in reading and forgets to push it back. His face is perfectly proportioned, the bones arranged in configurations that suggest he will grow into a handsome young man, the kind of face that causes no second glances, that fits seamlessly into the world, that allows its owner to move through life without the burden of being noticed for physical appearance rather than character or intelligence, without the constant awareness that comes when your face makes people uncomfortable, makes them stare, makes them react before they've had a chance to know anything about who you actually are. He is reading Pushkin, Eugene Onegin, the section where Tatiana writes her letter to Onegin confessing her love. That long passage of romantic desperation and hope and fear all tangled together in verse, that Maurice copies carefully into his personal notebook, his handwriting precise and beautiful, each letter formed with attention to aesthetics as well as legibility, as if the act of writing is itself a kind of art, a way of honouring the text by reproducing it with care. His lips move slightly as he reads, forming the words silently, tasting the language, learning its rhythms, absorbing the music of Russian, verse in ways that will stay with him forever, that will become part of how he thinks, how he processes emotion, how he understands the world. The door opens, his mother enters, and Morris looks up from his book automatically, the smile that crosses his face immediate and genuine because he loves her, and her presence means safety and warmth and approval, means the world is ordered correctly, means everything is as it should be. She is French, married to a Russian father Maurice barely remembers, a man who left when Maurice was 3, who sends money occasionally, but provides nothing resembling presence, nothing that looks like fatherhood, beyond the legal and financial minimum. A woman who taught her son her native language alongside Russian, who filled their home with French literature and French manners, and dreams of Paris, the city she left behind when she married, the city she describes with such longing that Maurice has constructed an entire geography in his imagination, has built a Paris in his mind that may bear little resemblance to the actual city, but feels more real than any place he's physically inhabited. She sits in the chair beside his desk, and even at 11, Maurice notices, without quite understanding what he's noticing, that she looks tired today, that there are shadows beneath her eyes that weren't there last month, that her hands shake slightly when she reaches to brush hair back from his forehead, that the gesture, which has always been casual, affectionate, easy, now seems to require effort, seems to cost her something. But he is 11. He notices these things without understanding what they mean, without recognizing the signs of illness that an adult would immediately identify as cause for concern, without the experience to know that bodies betray us gradually before they betray us catastrophically, that disease announces itself in small symptoms long before it produces the dramatic evidence that forces acknowledgement. Still, reading. Montresor. Her voice carries the slight accent that marks her as foreign even after 20 years in Russia, the way certain vowels elongate, the way she pronounces Maurice's name in the French style, rather than attempting a Russian approximation, the way she holds on to her native language like a lifeline connecting her to a place she will never see again, but cannot quite release. Maurice closes his notebook carefully, marking his place with a ribbon sewn into the binding. Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, the part where Tatiana writes her letter confessing her love. "And what do you think of Tatiana?" she asks, settling into the chair with a small sound that might be relief, might be pain, might be simple exhaustion from a day spent managing a household on insufficient funds, with insufficient help, while fighting an illness she has not yet named to her son. Is she brave or foolish to confess her feelings so openly? Maurice considers this with the seriousness that children apply to questions they believe adults actually want answered, questions that feel like tests of character rather than simple conversation. Brave, he says finally, because she knows he might reject her, but she writes anyway, because not knowing is worse than knowing, even if what you learn breaks your heart. His mother smiles, but there's something sad in the smile, something that suggests she's thinking about things beyond this conversation, beyond this warm room, beyond the present moment that will not last, that cannot last, that is already slipping away though neither of them knows it yet. You're wise for 11 years old, Maurice. Too wise, perhaps. Sometimes I wonder if you should be outside playing with other boys, instead of here with your books and your old mother. I like books, Maurice says simply, and I like being with you. She reaches for his hand, and her grip is weaker than it should be, weaker than it was last winter, but Maurice doesn't understand this yet, doesn't recognize that he's already begun losing her, that the process has already started, that will leave him orphaned in all the ways that matter, even though his father technically lives somewhere, technically exists as a legal entity responsible for Maurice's welfare, if not his actual care. The routine of his days, school in the morning at the gymnasium where he excels in languages and literature, where his teachers write notes to his mother praising his intelligence, his discipline, his potential for university study, his gift for absorbing complex ideas and rendering them back with clarity and precision. Afternoons spent reading or helping his mother with household accounts, his facility with numbers as strong as his facility with words, his mind equally comfortable with mathematical precision and literary interpretation. Evenings when his mother reads to him in French, the two of them sitting by the fire while snow piles against. The window panes and the outside world feels very far away, feels manageable, feels like something that will wait patiently until Maurice is ready to engage with it on his own terms. Winter deepens. His mother's cough worsens. The doctor visits more frequently, and Maurice learns to recognize the sound of serious conversations conducted in low voices, behind closed doors, learns to interpret the quality of silence that follows these conversations, learns that adults believe they're protecting children by not explaining things directly when actually the not knowing creates worse fear than truth ever could. And then Horace begins to notice pain in his jaw. Not severe, just a dull ache that comes and goes, that he mentions to his mother, who assumes it's a problem with his teeth, who promises to take him to the dentist when she's feeling better, when the weather improves, when life returns to normal, when the things that are wrong become right again through sheer force of wishing, through hope that refuses to acknowledge reality. But the pain doesn't stop. His mother dies in early spring, 2 months after Maurice's 13th birthday, when ice has begun breaking in the river, and the first green shoots are pushing through the soil that's been frozen for 6 months. Tuberculosis, they say, though the diagnosis came too late for treatment to matter, came only when death was already inevitable, already in progress, already unstoppable. She dies in her bed, with Maurice holding her hand, and her last words to him are in French. Tu es mon cœur, Maurice. Ne l'oublie jamais. You are my heart, Maurice. Never forget that. After her funeral, Maurice discovers that his father, remarried, living in Moscow, barely present in Maurice's life for the past decade, has made arrangements for Maurice to live with his uncle in Toulouse, France. A fresh start, a chance to honor his mother's dreams of seeing Maurice settled in the country she loved. The uncle, his mother's younger brother, a professor of literature at the university, has agreed to take in his sister's son to provide home and education and whatever guidance a bachelor professor can offer to a grieving 13-year-old boy. Maurice packs his books, his notebooks filled with careful handwriting, his mother's few pieces of jewelry that now belong to him, and that he will keep for the rest of his life, though he will never be able to wear them, will never be able to display them, will carry them with him as talismans of a life that ended when she died, of a future that died with her. He boards a train heading west across Europe toward a future he imagines will fulfill every dream his mother held for him, every hope she whispered to him in the dark, when her coughing kept them both awake, every promise she made about what his life could become if he worked hard and stayed true to himself, and never let the world convince him he was less than he actually was. Maurice sits in the train compartment, his reflection visible in the window glass, as countryside rushes past in the darkness outside. He touches his jaw, where the ache has become constant now, where the bone feels different beneath his fingers, harder, more prominent than it should be, where something is changing that he cannot see yet, cannot understand yet, cannot stop. He assumes the pain will pass. He assumes he is still the boy his mother loved. He assumes the future waiting for him in France will be the future he's been promised. He is wrong about all of it. Maurice arrives in Toulouse in late spring of 1903, when the city's distinctive pink brick glows amber in evening light, and the Garonne River runs high, with snowmelt from the Pyrenees. His uncle's home sits in the old quarter, where narrow streets wind between buildings that have stood for centuries, where cobblestones worn smooth by generations of feet create uneven pathways that catch rain in pools, where the air smells of bread baking and coffee roasting, and the particular mustiness that comes from stone buildings that never quite dry out, that hold moisture in their walls like memory. His uncle is a bachelor, a professor of literature at the university, a man who has agreed to take in his sister's son more from duty than enthusiasm, but who gradually comes to appreciate Maurice's intelligence and quiet manners, who discovers that raising a brilliant nephew requires less effort than he'd feared, that Maurice asks for little beyond books and privacy and occasional conversation about the text he's consuming with the hunger of someone who has discovered that reading offers refuge from grief, offers structure, when the world feels chaotic, offers control over at least one aspect of existence when everything else seems subject to forces beyond influence or understanding. Maurice enrolls in the lycée. He makes friends cautiously, aware that he's the new student, the Russian boy with the French mother who died, the one who speaks flawless French, but with an accent that marks him as not quite local, not quite foreign, suspended in that uncertain space between belonging and otherness that defines the experience of anyone who has moved between cultures, who carries multiple identities without fully inhabiting any single one. He works hard. He reads everything the curriculum requires, and everything it doesn't. He dreams of university admission, of studying law, of making arguments in courtrooms where logic matters more than appearance, where intelligence determines outcome, where he can honor his mother's memory by becoming someone she would have been proud to claim as son. 6 months after arriving in France, during a routine physical examination required by the school, the doctor notices something. His fingers probe Maurice's jaw, his forehead, the bones of his hands, and his expression shifts from routine professional assessment to focused attention, to the look of someone who has recognized something significant and is calculating implications, measuring severity, determining how to proceed. He asks questions in that carefully neutral tone doctors use when they don't want to alarm patients before they've confirmed their suspicions. When did the swelling begin? Has there been pain? Any vision problems? Difficulty breathing? Headaches? Changes in shoe size or glove fit? Maurice answers honestly, because he's 14 and still believes that honesty with authority figures leads to help rather than harm, still trusts that adults who ask questions are genuinely interested in providing solutions rather than merely documenting problems they cannot or will not fix. The pain started almost 2 years ago, he says. It's worse now than it was. His hands ache in the mornings, joints stiff until he flexes them repeatedly, until he forces movement through tissue that seems reluctant to bend. His shoes don't fit anymore, even though he hasn't grown significantly taller, even though his height has stabilized in ways that suggest he's reached his adult stature. That vertical growth has ended, even as something else continues expanding. His face feels tight, like the skin is being stretched over bones that are pushing outward from within, that are reshaping the architecture of his skull in ways that make looking in mirrors uncomfortable, that make him avoid his own reflection, because seeing the changes requires acknowledging that something is wrong, that his body is betraying him in ways he cannot understand or control. The doctor's expression changes, not shock, because doctors are trained to maintain composure, trained to receive disturbing information without visible reaction that might frighten patients or undermine the professional authority that depends partly on appearing unshakable, on seeming to possess knowledge and control that transcends ordinary human vulnerability to fear and uncertainty. But something careful enters his face, something controlled, the look of someone who has recognized something serious and is calculating how to communicate it without causing panic, without destroying hope prematurely, without inflicting more damage than the diagnosis itself will inevitably create. The word he speaks, acromegaly. Maurice has never heard this word before. It sounds medical, Greek or Latin, the kind of term that exists to create distance between the thing itself and the people who suffer from it, to transform human experience into clinical category, to make manageable through naming what would otherwise be too terrible to confront directly. The doctor explains in that measured tone medical professionals use when delivering bad news, when transforming catastrophe into information, when trying to help patients understand that their lives have just changed in ways they cannot undo, cannot escape, cannot negotiate away through good behavior or hard work or any of the strategies that allow people to believe they control their own destinies. A disorder of the pituitary gland, he says. The gland, small as a pea, sits at the base of the brain and produces hormones that regulate growth. In acromegaly, the gland produces too much growth hormone. The bones continue growing long after they should have stopped. Not all bones, because the long bones of the arms and legs stop responding to growth hormone after adolescence, regardless of how much the pituitary produces. But the bones of the face, hands, feet, jaw, brow, they keep growing. They respond to the excess hormone by expanding, thickening, reshaping themselves into configurations that transform familiar features into something unrecognizable, something that other people will struggle to process as human, something that will make Maurice's life immeasurably harder in ways that have nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with how humans react to faces that deviate from expected patterns, that trigger ancient responses coded deep in neural architecture, responses that evolved to help our ancestors identify threats, but that now mostly serve to make life unbearable for anyone whose appearance falls outside narrow parameters of acceptable variation. Is there treatment? Maurice asks this in a voice that's still a child's voice, despite his 14 years, still carrying hope that adults can fix problems, that medicine can reverse what's happening, that science possesses power over biology, that human ingenuity can overcome genetic accident, that wanting something badly enough makes it possible. The doctor's answer comes slowly, each word chosen with care, each phrase constructed to communicate truth without destroying whatever emotional equilibrium Maurice has maintained despite learning that his body is transforming in ways that will make his dreams impossible. No treatment, no cure, no way to stop the progression. The condition will continue until the pituitary gland stops overproducing hormone on its own, which might happen in years or might never happen, or until complications emerge that prove incompatible with continued life. Heart failure is common, he says. The heart muscle grows along with everything else, becomes too large for efficient function, struggles to pump blood through a circulatory system that was designed for a smaller body, a normal body, a body that wasn't fighting against its own biology. Respiratory failure is also common. The airway narrows as facial bones expand. Breathing becomes difficult, then dangerous, then impossible. How long does he have? Maurice asks this question, though part of him doesn't want the answer, though knowing feels more terrifying than uncertainty, though once the doctor speaks the truth aloud, it will become real in ways that speculation and private fear cannot make real. Years, the doctor says. Perhaps decades. The condition progresses slowly, he adds, as if this should provide comfort, as if knowing that the transformation will take time makes the outcome any less terrible, as if spreading suffering across years, rather than months, somehow reduces the total quantity of pain rather than merely extending it, drawing it out, making it something Maurice will have to endure day after day after day, with no end visible, no terminus, where he can say the worst is over, the suffering has concluded, the transformation is complete. Maurice leaves the doctor's office understanding that he is dying just very, very slowly, and that the process of dying will transform him into something people will not want to look at, something that will make children cry and adults turn away, something that will cost him every dream his mother held for him, every future he'd imagined for himself, every possibility that depends on being seen as human rather than as aberration, as monster, as thing. He is 15 when Celeste from his literature class invites him to the school dance. She has dark hair and laughs at his jokes and seems genuinely interested when he discusses the books they're reading, when he offers interpretations that go beyond what the teacher has said, that show he's thinking rather than merely memorizing, that demonstrate intelligence and creativity and all the qualities that should matter more than physical appearance, but somehow never do. Not really. Not when appearance deviates too far from acceptable norms. He allows himself to hope that maybe the changes in his face aren't as noticeable as he fears, that maybe people can look past physical appearance to see the person underneath, that maybe Celeste represents the beginning of normal adolescent experiences, normal romance, normal life, despite the diagnosis, despite the progression, despite everything the doctor said about inevitable transformation. He borrows a suit from his uncle. It has to be altered because his hands are too large for the sleeves, his shoulders too broad for the jacket, his neck too thick for the collar to close properly. But the tailor manages to make it fit well enough that Maurice can tell himself he looks presentable, can convince himself that he appears normal enough to pass, to blend in, to spend one evening pretending that his body is not betraying him, that his future is not already determined by biology beyond his control. At the dance, Celeste sees him, and her smile falters. Just for a moment, just long enough for Maurice to understand that whatever she imagined when she invited him 3 weeks ago, the reality standing before her now is different, worse. His face has changed even in those 3 weeks. His brow ridge is more prominent, throwing his eyes into deeper shadow. His jaw juts further forward, creating an underbite that makes his profile look simian, prehistoric, like something from anthropology textbooks rather than from the halls of a respected lycée. His teeth don't quite fit together correctly anymore, the alignment disrupted by bone growth that has pushed his lower jaw beyond where it should sit. beyond where it can comfortably meet the upper teeth in normal occlusion. She dances with him because she's polite, because backing out now would be cruel, because French manners require courtesy, even when revulsion lurks beneath the surface, even when everything in her wants to flee, to escape, to pretend she never invited this boy, who is somehow transformed into something else, something she cannot quite categorize, cannot quite process, cannot quite bear to touch, more than absolutely necessary. But she holds herself at a distance. She doesn't meet his eyes. And when the dance ends, she makes excuses about needing to find her other friends, about not feeling well, about anything that allows her to escape without having to explicitly reject him, without having to say aloud what her face has already communicated, what Maurice has already understood from the moment her smile faltered. Maurice stands alone at the edge of the dance floor, watching other couples move together in time to music, watching easy intimacy and casual touch and all the ordinary experiences of adolescence that will never be available to him. Not now, not ever, not while his face continues changing, continues becoming less human and more monstrous with every passing month. He is 16 when the new teacher flinches. The man has joined the faculty mid-year, hasn't yet learned to see past Maurice's appearance, hasn't yet developed the professional courtesy that requires pretending not to notice, not to react, not to show visible discomfort at the sight of a student whose face belongs in medical textbooks rather than classrooms. Maurice raises his hand to answer a question about Voltaire, and when the teacher calls on him, when Maurice begins to speak, the man actually recoils, a visible backward movement of his entire body, as if Maurice has threatened him, as if the sound of that voice emerging from that face is too jarring to process, too disturbing to bear without physical reaction. Other students notice. They laugh, uncomfortable laughter that acknowledges the awkwardness, that releases tension, that allows them to participate in the moment without having to examine too closely what they're actually laughing at, what they're actually endorsing, what they're actually doing to the classmate they've known for years, who has always been kind, who has never done anything to deserve this casual cruelty except have the misfortune of developing a condition that transforms faces into nightmares. Maurice completes his answer, his voice steady despite the humiliation, despite the laughter, despite understanding that this is his life now, that this will always be his life, that every room he enters will contain at least one person who cannot hide their reaction, who will flinch or gasp or stare or turn away, who will make him responsible for their discomfort, who will punish him for the crime of existing in a body that makes them uneasy. He is 17 when he forces himself to stand before the mirror in his bedroom, gas lamp turned up bright so there's no shadow to hide in, no merciful dimness to soften the reality, no way to pretend he doesn't understand what has happened, what is still happening, what will continue happening until death or miracle intervenes. His reflection, almost unrecognizable from the child who boarded a train in Russia 5 years ago. His head massive, the skull expanded to accommodate the overgrowth of bone that has pushed outward in every direction, that has created a head too large for normal hats, too broad for normal doorways, if he doesn't turn slightly, too heavy for comfort, the weight of it creating constant pressure on his neck, constant strain on muscles that were never designed to support this much mass. His forehead, a shelf of bone that throws his eyes into permanent shadow, that makes his face look primitive, aggressive, threatening even when his expression is neutral, even when he's smiling, even when he's trying desperately to appear friendly, approachable, human. His jaw jutted so far forward that his profile looks more like a sketch of Neanderthal reconstruction than a modern human, more like something from evolutionary museums than from contemporary France, more like evidence of species that should have gone extinct millennia ago than like a young man in 1907 who reads philosophy and writes poetry and dreams of futures that his face has made impossible, his hands hanging at his sides, each one large enough to palm a man's head, fingers thick and swollen, the knuckles grotesque, with excess bone growth that has transformed what were once normal hands, graceful hands, hands that could write beautiful script and turn pages carefully and gesture expressively during conversation, into clubs, into weapons, into appendages that frighten people, even when Maurice means no harm, even when he's trying to be gentle, even when he keeps them carefully still precisely because he understands that movement draws attention, that attention creates fear, that fear creates distance he cannot bridge, no matter how carefully he behaves. But what makes it worse, what transforms this from medical tragedy into existential horror, is that his eyes haven't changed. They're still the same eyes that looked out from the beautiful child's face, still intelligent, still capable of expressing every human emotion, still unmistakably the eyes of a person who thinks and feels and dreams and hopes despite what the rest of his face has become, despite the monstrous architecture that surrounds them, despite the fact that most people never look at his eyes long enough to see what lives there, because they cannot get past the skull, the jaw, the overwhelming wrongness of bones arranged in configurations that human eyes did not evolve to process as safe, as familiar, as acceptable. Maurice understands in this moment, standing before the mirror in lamplight that reveals every detail without mercy, that the world will never let him be a lawyer, or a professor, or any of the respectable professions his intelligence would have qualified him for if his body hadn't betrayed him, because people cannot look past his face long enough to hear his arguments, to appreciate his knowledge, to recognize that the monster appearance houses a brilliant mind, a gentle soul, a person who deserves the same opportunities, the same respect, the same basic human dignity that others receive without having to fight for it, without having to prove themselves worthy of treatment. That should be automatic. That should be guaranteed. That should not depend on whether your face fits within acceptable parameters of human variation. He turns away from the mirror and never looks at himself directly again unless absolutely necessary. Maurice stands inside a cage for the first time on a Tuesday evening in July of 1914, when summer heat has turned the carnival tent into an oven that traps air and sweat and the accumulated breath of 50 strangers who have paid 1 franc each to stare at him, to consume his appearance as entertainment, to transform his suffering into their evening's amusement. The promoter, a man named Dubois, who runs a mid-tier traveling carnival that moves through provincial towns across southern France, has positioned the cage center stage on a platform raised 3 feet off the ground, so that even children in the back rows can see clearly, can observe without obstruction, can get their money's worth. Describe the cage in detail, because it will become Maurice's home for the next 5 years, will become the physical boundary that defines his existence, that separates him from the world in ways that go beyond mere iron bars, that transforms him from person into exhibit, from Maurice into the wild man, from individual with history and dreams and private thoughts into spectacle designed for public consumption. 8 feet square, iron bars, spaced close enough that Maurice cannot squeeze between them, even if he wanted to, even if he tried, even if escape seemed worth the humiliation of attempting. A wooden stool positioned center cage, where Maurice sits during shows, where he performs the essential function of being visible, of being available to eyes that have paid for access, that believe their franc entitles them to stare without guilt, to gawk without shame, to consume without considering what it costs the person being consumed. A bucket in the corner for waste, because Dubois allows Maurice out of the cage only twice daily, morning and night, always supervised, always watched, always reminded that freedom is a privilege granted temporarily, rather than a right he possesses inherently. No privacy curtain, no dignity beyond what Maurice can construct for himself through bearing and silence, and the internal resources he's developed through years of knowing that the world will not grant him basic courtesies unless he demands nothing, accepts everything, and never complains about treatment that would be recognized as cruelty if applied to anyone whose face fit within normal parameters. Dubois has dressed Maurice in rough canvas trousers and a loose shirt that suggests primitiveness, wildness, something barely civilized, barely contained, barely safe for public viewing. The costume is deliberate, calculated to enhance the narrative Dubois will sell to audiences, to make Maurice look less like a man with a medical condition and more like a creature captured from mountains, a wild thing brought to civilization for educational purposes, for scientific interest, for the advancement of human knowledge about what forms life can take when nature makes mistakes, when biology produces variations that evolution would normally eliminate but which modern medicine keeps alive long enough to display, to study, to transform into profit. Maurice's own clothes, the suits he wore to school, the books he carried, the notebooks filled with his careful handwriting and his copied verses from Pushkin and Voltaire, are locked in a trunk backstage, artifacts of a life that no longer exists, evidence of a person who has been erased and replaced by a character, by a performance, by a role Maurice must play in order to eat, to sleep indoors, to survive in a world that offers no legitimate employment to someone who looks like he does, who frightens children and unsettles adults and makes everyone uncomfortable in ways they cannot quite articulate, but which they express through avoidance, through rejection, through the systematic closing of every door Maurice tries to open. The first audience arrives as evening deepens into night, as gas lamps are lit throughout the carnival grounds, as the calls of barkers and the music of the carousel and the screams from the ghost train blend into a wall of sound that makes individual voices impossible to distinguish, that creates an atmosphere of controlled chaos designed to loosen inhibitions, to encourage spending, to make ordinary people feel they've entered a different world where normal rules don't apply, where looking at human suffering becomes entertainment rather than cruelty, because the carnival itself transforms everything it touches into spectacle, into performance, into something that exists for pleasure rather than demanding moral consideration. Dubois works the crowd expertly outside the tent, his voice carrying the practiced rhythms of a man who has done this for 20 years, who knows exactly which words generate maximum shock and fascination, who understands that audiences want their entertainment pre-interpreted, want to be told what they're seeing before they see it, so they can react appropriately, so they can feel the emotions they've paid to feel, without having to think too carefully about whether those emotions are appropriate, whether the entertainment they're consuming comes at someone else's expense, whether the franc they've spent purchases something they should be ashamed of wanting. Maurice sits on his stool inside the tent and listens to Dubois gather the crowd, listens to the story that has nothing to do with Maurice's actual history, that erases everything he actually is and replaces it with fiction, designed to make looking easier, to make staring feel justified, to transform Maurice from person suffering medical tragedy into curiosity that exists for their benefit, for their education, for their amusement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dubois calls out in the voice that carries across carnival noise, across evening air, across the boundary between outside world and tent interior. "What you are about to witness is the most fearsome specimen ever captured from the wild mountains of the Caucasus, discovered." living in a cave, subsisting on raw meat, speaking no known language, possessing strength that required 6 men to subdue. We have brought him here at tremendous expense and considerable danger to our handlers, so that you, the civilized people of France, might witness what humanity looked like before civilization tamed our savage nature, before education refined our instincts, before culture transformed us from beasts into beings capable of reason and refinement. Maurice sits in his cage and listens to this fabrication, this complete erasure of everything he actually is, educated and multilingual and gentle by nature and peaceful by choice, replaced by a narrative that makes him easier to categorize, easier to gawk at without guilt, easier to consume as entertainment, because if he's truly wild, truly monstrous, truly something other than human, then looking becomes scientific interest rather than voyeuristic cruelty, then paying to stare becomes educational rather than exploitative, then the discomfort audiences feel transforms from shame at their own behavior into appropriate fear of something genuinely dangerous, genuinely threatening, genuinely worthy of the cages and chains and careful supervision that Dubois describes. The tent fills. Bodies press onto wooden benches, jostle for better views, shift and whisper and point as Dubois leads them inside with theatrical gestures, with promises of spectacle, with warnings about maintaining safe distance from the cage, because this creature has been known to attack, has killed men in the mountains, remains fundamentally wild despite months of attempted domestication. Dubois stands beside the cage and continues his performance, and Maurice understands that he is watching a master at work, watching someone who has studied human nature and learned exactly how to manipulate emotion, how to generate fascination mixed with horror, how to make people feel they're witnessing something important, something rare, something worth the franc they've paid, and the time they've spent, and the moral compromise they're making by treating another human being as spectacle, rather than as person deserving basic dignity. The audience stares. Some gasp when they see Maurice clearly for the first time, when lamplight reveals the full extent of his transformation, when the reality exceeds whatever they'd imagined, based on Dubois' promises outside. Some laugh nervously, the kind of laughter that releases tension, that signals discomfort, that allows them to participate without having to fully acknowledge what they're participating in, what they're supporting through their presence, through their money, through their willingness to consume human suffering as entertainment. Children hide behind their parents, peek around adult bodies with expressions of mingled fear and fascination, learn early that some people exist to be stared at, that some bodies are acceptable subjects for open gawking, that the normal rules about politeness and respect don't apply when the person being observed looks sufficiently different, sufficiently monstrous, sufficiently other, and Maurice makes a choice that will define how he survives the next 5 years, makes it consciously and deliberately and with full understanding of what it costs him, what it requires him to sacrifice, what it means about who he must become in order to endure. He decides to give them what they came for. Not violence, because he will never be violent, will never confirm the narrative that his appearance makes him dangerous, will never allow Dubois' lies to become truth through his own actions, but spectacle, performance, the willing participation in his own objectification, because resistance would accomplish nothing except making his own life harder, except provoking Dubois to punishments Maurice has already learned to avoid, except demonstrating that he still believes his dignity matters, when the world has made abundantly clear that it does not, that dignity is a luxury reserved for people whose faces don't frighten children. He stands from his stool, moves to the bars with movements that are deliberate, controlled, designed to emphasize his size without suggesting actual threat. He grips the iron bars with his massive hands, and the image is perfect for Dubois' narrative, perfect for the story the audience wants to believe. The wild thing barely contained, the monster testing the strength of its cage, the creature that would tear them apart if given opportunity, but which civilization has successfully imprisoned, has successfully transformed from threat into entertainment, from danger into spectacle they can safely consume. His size does the work Dubois requires. Standing, Maurice is imposing in ways that sitting disguised, his shoulders filling the width of the cage, his head massive enough that it seems the bars should not be adequate to contain him, his hands wrapped around iron, making the cage seem fragile, temporary, insufficient. His face, expressionless, but unavoidably strange, speaks to everything the audience has been primed to see. The monster, the wild thing, the creature from nightmares and fairy tales, and the primitive past that civilization has supposedly transcended. They scream, they applaud, they throw coins onto the platform, metal clinking against wood, payment for the thrill of fear experienced safely, for the horror consumed without actual danger, for the opportunity to feel superior to something, to someone, to congratulate themselves on their own normalcy, their own civilization, their own good fortune at being born with faces that allow them to sit on benches rather than stand in cages. And Maurice returns to his stool, sits down, and waits for the next show to begin in 2 hours. And the show after that, and the show after that, 5 shows daily, every day, week after week, month after month, year after year, until the routine becomes automatic, becomes something his body performs while his mind retreats to places Dubois cannot reach, to memories Dubois cannot control, to the internal landscape where Maurice remains himself, even when the world insists he is only the monster they've paid to see. William Steig is 83 years old in 1990 when he sits in his New York studio working on sketches for a children's book that will be called Shrek, a name that comes from the Yiddish word for fear, for terror, for the visceral response humans have to things that frighten them, to appearances that trigger ancient warnings coded into neural architecture, that says danger, says threat, says something is wrong with this configuration of features, this arrangement of bone and flesh that deviates too far from expected patterns to process as safe, as familiar, as acceptable. Steig has been illustrating children's books for decades, has developed a distinctive style that emphasizes character over prettiness, that values expressiveness over conventional beauty, that understands children respond to honesty in illustration, to drawings that capture emotional truth, rather than idealized versions of reality that teach them early to distrust their own perceptions, to believe that real bodies and real faces matter less than fantasy versions that exist nowhere except in imagination and advertising and the carefully curated images that tell everyone what beauty should look like, what normal should look like, what acceptable should look like. He wants to create an ogre who inverts fairy tale expectations, who is ugly on the outside, but not evil, not dangerous, not the villain that appearance would traditionally signal in stories that teach children to judge character by appearance, to trust beautiful people and fear ugly ones, to believe that physical form reflects moral essence in ways that make the world simple, comprehensible, safe, because if monsters look like monsters, then you know who to avoid, who to fear, who to reject before they have opportunity to harm you. But Steig wants something different. He wants an ogre who is perfectly comfortable in his own skin, who doesn't care what others think of his appearance, who lives alone in a swamp not because he's been rejected, but because he chooses solitude, who finds peace in isolation rather than suffering from it, who represents a kind of self-acceptance that children need to see, that everyone needs to see, that offers alternative to the constant pressure to conform, to modify, to change yourself to fit expectations that may have nothing to do with who you actually are or who you want to become. The sketches accumulate on his drawing table. Early versions showed generic ogre features, the standard visual vocabulary of fairy tale monsters: lumpy body, crude features, exaggerated proportions that signal otherness without referencing anything specific, anything real, anything that might make readers uncomfortable by suggesting that real people, real bodies, real faces might share characteristics with the monster being depicted, might see themselves reflected in illustrations meant to represent something fundamentally different from human, fundamentally other than acceptable. But these generic sketches don't satisfy Steg. They feel too safe, too familiar, too much like every other fairy tale monster that has come before. He wants specificity. He wants his ogre to feel real, to feel grounded in actual physical possibility, rather than floating in the abstract realm of pure fantasy where monsters exist only in imagination, where ugliness is purely theoretical rather than something that actual human beings experience, endure, suffer from in ways that fairy tales never acknowledge, never address, never consider. Because acknowledging that real people look like monsters would require confronting uncomfortable truths about how society treats difference, how humans respond to appearance, how much suffering is inflicted daily on people whose only crime is having faces that don't fit within narrow parameters of acceptable variation. Stig finds his reference in a wrestling history book, in photographs of Maurice Tillet, taken during the height of his career when he was performing as the French Angel, when his face was being sold as spectacle, when his appearance was generating revenue for promoters who understood that horror and fascination sell tickets, that people will pay to see what frightens them if the fear comes with safety, with distance, with the assurance that they're observing rather than experiencing, consuming rather than becoming. The photographs show Maurice in wrestling costume, posed for maximum dramatic effect, his features emphasized by lighting that casts deep shadows, that makes the bone structure more pronounced, that transforms a man with a medical condition into something that looks mythological, that looks like it belongs in legends rather than in Chicago, that looks like it should be fighting heroes in epic narratives rather than performing choreographed combat in sports arenas. Stieg studies the photographs, the massive brow ridge that creates shelf of bone above the eyes, the jutting jaw that pushes forward in ways that make the profile look primitive, prehistoric, like something from evolutionary museums, the broad nose, the thick neck, the enormous hands, the overall impression of size and power and fundamental difference from normal human proportions. And he begins to draw. His ogre takes shape with features borrowed directly from Maurice's face, translated into illustration style, but unmistakably derived from those wrestling photographs, unmistakably connected to that specific configuration of bones, that specific arrangement of features that acromegaly created, that made Maurice's life unbearable, that cost him every dream he held, that transformed him from brilliant student into carnival exhibit, into wrestling spectacle, into man who died alone, except for one friend, one person who saw past the face to recognize the human being living behind it. But Steig's ogre is not tragic. Steig's ogre is not lonely in ways that hurt. Steig's ogre is, in fact, perfectly content to be exactly what he is, an ogre living alone in a swamp, bothered only when others intrude on his peace, when fairy tale creatures are dumped on his property, when the outside world forces itself into the isolation he's chosen, the solitude he prefers, the life he's built around not caring what anyone thinks, because caring would require wanting acceptance, that fairy tales have never offered ogres, that the world has never offered anyone who looks sufficiently different, sufficiently monstrous, sufficiently other. The picture book, published in 1990, becomes moderately successful. Not a massive bestseller, but respected, appreciated, noted for its subversive approach to fairy tale conventions, its willingness to make the monster the protagonist, its gentle humor that comes from inverting expectations rather than from cruelty, from mockery, from the kind of jokes that requires someone to be the target, the victim, the butt of humor that entertains by degrading. Stig never mentions Maurice Tillet, never acknowledges in interviews or author's notes that his ogre's face came from a real person, from a man who suffered real loneliness, who experienced real rejection, who would have given anything to be the ogre in the swamp, who doesn't care about acceptance because the real Maurice cared desperately, wanted desperately, longed desperately for the kind of belonging that his face made impossible, for the kind of love that requires looking past appearance to value character and intelligence and gentleness, for the kind of recognition that acknowledges humanity regardless of how the human body is configured, regardless of what features the face displays, regardless of whether the person looking at you has to overcome revulsion to see who you actually are. In 2001, DreamWorks Animation adapts Stig's book into a feature film that expands the story into a romance, into a meditation on beauty and acceptance, into a narrative about finding love when society says you're unlovable, when your appearance marks you as unworthy, when everyone around you has decided based purely on how you look that you cannot possibly deserve happiness, deserve partnership, deserve the ordinary experiences that everyone else takes for granted as birthright rather than privilege, as automatic rather than as something that must be fought for, earned, justified through extraordinary virtue or extraordinary achievement or extraordinary willingness to accept whatever scraps of affection might be offered by people who can overcome their initial revulsion long enough to recognize that the monster might also be a person. The film's central message resonates with millions. True love looks past surface appearance to recognize internal beauty, to value character over appearance, to understand that physical form matters less than the person inhabiting that form, that the soul deserves love regardless of what housing it occupies, that everyone, regardless of how they look, deserves the possibility of connection, of partnership, of the kind of love that doesn't require you to change, to improve, to become something other than what you are in order to deserve basic human warmth, basic human acceptance, basic recognition that you matter. It is a beautiful message, progressive for its time, genuinely meaningful for audiences who have felt marginalized or rejected because of how they look, because of bodies that don't conform to standards that advertising and media and social pressure have established as normal, as acceptable, as worthy of love and desire, and all the good things that life offers to people whose faces fit within approved parameters. The film helps millions of people, provides vocabulary for discussing acceptance and difference, creates cultural space for conversations about beauty standards and their arbitrariness, their cruelty, their capacity to inflict suffering on people who have done nothing wrong, except have the misfortune of being born into bodies that deviate from narrow definitions of acceptable appearance. These are real goods, real benefits. The film's existence has likely made the world marginally better for people who need its message, who need to hear that they deserve love, who need to see characters who look different, finding happiness, finding acceptance, finding the happy endings that real life so often denies, to anyone whose appearance marks them as other, as wrong, as fundamentally incompatible with the visual landscape of normal human society. But the distance between Shrek's fantasy and Maurice's reality remains unbridgeable, remains absolute, remains the kind of gap that makes the film's success feel like cruel irony rather than triumph, like erasure rather than acknowledgement, like the world has taken Maurice's face and used it to tell a story that he would have desperately wanted to be true, but which bore no resemblance to his actual experience, to the actual loneliness he endured, to the actual rejection he faced daily from people who could not look past his appearance long enough to recognize his intelligence, his gentleness, his capacity for love that had nowhere to go, no one to receive it, no possibility of reciprocation except in the single friendship that sustained him through decades of being treated as spectacle rather than as person. Shrek gets a happy ending because he's a cartoon, because writers can decree that Fiona loves him, because the narrative can be structured to deliver exactly the outcome that feels satisfying and just and right. Maurice got a happy ending only in the limited sense that he found one friend, that he achieved professional success, that he died peacefully, rather than in the cage or in poverty or alone in some institution where people who look like him are hidden away, so that normal people don't have to be reminded that bodies can betray us, that genetics can create monsters, that any of us might have been Maurice if different genes had expressed differently, if different hormones had malfunctioned, if different accidents of biology had occurred in the mysterious process that transforms cells into people. In 1942, Maurice meets Carl Pogello at a wrestling event in Philadelphia, backstage in the cramped area where competitors prepare for matches, where the performance hasn't yet begun and men can briefly exist as themselves, rather than as the characters they portray in the ring, where the careful construction of persona gives way temporarily to ordinary human interaction, to the mundane conversations about weather and food and trivial complaints that constitute normalcy, that remind everyone involved that wrestling is work, is performance, is something they do, rather than something they are. Carl is everything. Maurice is not. Conventionally handsome in the way that makes promoters happy, makes crowds enthusiastic, makes success seem inevitable, because people want to look at him, want to admire him, want to imagine themselves as him in ways they will never want to imagine themselves as Maurice. Socially graceful in ways Maurice has never mastered, capable of moving through rooms and conversations with ease that suggests he's never had to think carefully about every word, every gesture, every facial expression to avoid triggering reactions he cannot control, responses he cannot prevent, the constant vigilance required when your appearance makes every interaction fraught with potential for rejection, for revulsion, for the casual cruelty that comes when people forget or don't care that the monster can hear them, can understand them, can be hurt by words even when his face suggests he's beyond such ordinary human vulnerabilities. They should have nothing in common. They come from different worlds, have lived different lives, carry different burdens and different privileges and different understandings of what it means to move through the world in bodies that determine how others respond before character or intelligence or any other quality has opportunity to register. Carl has never been rejected because of how he looks, has never experienced the particular loneliness that comes from being visible everywhere while remaining fundamentally unseen, from being noticed constantly while never being known, from being the subject of attention that never translates into recognition, into connection, into the ordinary human warmth that comes from being valued for who you are rather than what you look like. But Carl sees something in Maurice that others miss, or perhaps he simply has the emotional capacity and moral courage to look past appearance, to recognize intelligence and gentleness and the kind of quiet dignity that Maurice has maintained despite everything, despite the carnival and the cage and the decades of being treated as spectacle rather than person, despite having every reason to become bitter, cruel, angry at a world that has given him strength and fame and financial security, while withholding the only thing he actually wants, the only thing that matters, the simple acceptance that doesn't come with asterisks and conditions, and the constant awareness that you're being tolerated rather than welcomed, accommodated rather than embraced. Carl approaches Maurice after a match where the crowd had been particularly vicious in their mockery, chanting monster and freak despite Maurice's victory, despite his technical skill, despite the fact that he'd won cleanly without relying purely on strength, had demonstrated the kind of wrestling intelligence that should earn respect, but which his face prevents audiences from acknowledging, because they cannot see past the surface, cannot recognize skill when it's housed in a body that frightens them, that triggers responses coded so deep in human neurology that conscious choice becomes irrelevant, becomes powerless against instinct that evolved to help ancestors survive by identifying threats based on visual deviation from expected human patterns. Maurice sits alone in the locker room, head in his massive hands, shoulders curved inward in, posture that suggests defeat despite the victory he's just earned, that reveals the truth Carl is perceptive enough to recognize, that winning means nothing when the price of winning is being reminded constantly that you're valued only for the spectacle you provide, only for the horror and fascination your face generates, only for your willingness to perform your own monstrosity for crowds who will never see you as anything except the thing they've paid to watch. Carl sits beside Maurice on the bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touch, close enough that the gesture communicates solidarity rather than pity, companionship rather than charity, the kind of proximity that says I am choosing to be here rather than I am obligated to comfort you, that makes all the difference between kindness that condescends and kindness that respects, that recognizes Maurice as equal rather than as object requiring intervention, requiring rescue, requiring the kind of help that reinforces hierarchy between helper and helped. They'll never see me as human, Maurice says quietly, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from emotional labor, from the constant effort required to maintain composure when every instinct screams to rage, to weep, to demand recognition, that will never come no matter how loudly you insist, no matter how clearly you articulate your humanity, no matter how many times you prove that the monster face houses a person who bleeds and hurts and longs for connection, just like everyone else. 28 years of this, and they still see the monster first. Only the monster. Always the monster. Carl doesn't offer empty platitudes about how appearance doesn't matter, doesn't insult Maurice's intelligence, by pretending that physical appearance isn't fundamental to how humans evaluate each other, how they make instantaneous judgments about safety and attractiveness and whether someone deserves kindness or deserves distance, whether someone merits engagement or merits avoidance. They both know appearance matters. They both understand that the world judges faces before it considers character, that visual processing happens faster than rational thought, that by the time conscious evaluation begins, the damage is already done, the impression already formed, the category already assigned. Instead, Carl says simply, I see you as human. Does that count for anything? Maurice looks at his friend, and there's something in his expression that's almost a smile, almost hope, almost the beginning of belief that maybe one person seeing him completely, one person knowing him truly, one person staying despite having every option to leave, might be enough, might be sufficient, might constitute the happy ending that life will grant him, even if it's not the fairy tale ending he wanted when he was young, when he still believed that intelligence and goodness would be rewarded, that the world was fundamentally fair, that appearance mattered less than substance in determining who received love and who remained alone. It counts for everything, Maurice says. They become friends in the way that matters, in the way that transcends casual acquaintance or professional collegiality, in the way that creates genuine intimacy, genuine knowledge, genuine care that doesn't depend on performance or utility, or what one person can do for the other, but exists simply because connection formed, because understanding developed, because two people discovered they valued each other's company, each other's conversation, each other's presence in ways that make life more bearable, that make suffering more endurable, that make the prospect of tomorrow less bleak, because tomorrow will include continuation of this friendship, this relationship, this one place where Maurice can exist as himself, rather than as the French angel, as Maurice rather than as monster, as person rather than as spectacle. Carl visits Maurice's apartment in Chicago, sees the books that line every wall, that overflow shelves and stack on tables and pile beside the reading chair, where Maurice spends hours when he's not training, when he's not performing, when he's simply living the life he would have chosen if choice had been available, if his face hadn't determined his path, if intelligence had mattered more than appearance in deciding what futures were possible. They discuss philosophy and politics and art. They argue about literature with the kind of passionate engagement that comes when both parties are intelligent enough to construct real arguments, knowledgeable enough to support positions with evidence, secure enough in friendship that disagreement doesn't threaten relationship, doesn't suggest rejection, doesn't require one person to submit or concede, but allows genuine intellectual combat that both find exhilarating, that both have missed, that both need in ways they didn't fully recognize until friendship provided it. They spend evenings playing chess and talking about everything except wrestling, everything except the performance that funds their lives, but doesn't define who they actually are when no audience is watching, when no role is required, when they can simply be two men who enjoy each other's company, who value each other's minds, who have discovered that friendship doesn't require similarity of experience or appearance or circumstance, but only mutual respect and genuine affection, and the willingness to see each other clearly, to know each other truly, to stay even when staying requires effort, requires looking past surface to recognize substance, requires choosing connection over the easier path of avoidance that most people take when confronted with difference, that makes them uncomfortable. This is the happy ending Maurice actually gets. Not romance, because the women he falls in love with over the years, and there are several, women who are kind to him, who talk with him, who seem to enjoy his company, never reciprocate his feelings in ways that lead to partnership, to commitment, to the kind of love that transforms loneliness into belonging, that creates home in another person, rather than merely in geography or architecture. Not public acceptance, because audiences will always see the French angel, rather than Maurice Tillet, will always value him for spectacle rather than substance, will always pay to watch the monster perform without ever recognizing the brilliant mind that choreographs the performance, that calculates each move, that understands exactly what role he's playing and why it works, and what it cost him every time he steps into the ring, but one person who sees him completely, one person who knows about the books and the languages and the dreams deferred by biology beyond his control, one person who stays not because Maurice is useful or profitable or interesting in the way that curiosities are interesting, but because Carl genuinely values Maurice's friendship, genuinely enjoys Maurice's company, genuinely loves Maurice in the way that friends love each other when friendship is real, rather than merely convenient, when connection is deep rather than merely cordial, when relationship provides something essential that neither person can find elsewhere. In 1954, Maurice retires from professional wrestling. He's 62 years old, and the acromegaly is causing complications that make continuing impossible, that make even basic movement difficult in ways it hasn't been before, in ways that suggest the progression has entered new phase, final phase, the stage where excess growth hormone has stressed organs beyond their capacity to compensate, where the heart muscle that grew too large struggles to pump blood efficiently, where breathing requires conscious effort because airways have narrowed as facial bones continued expanding, where every system that kept Maurice alive despite his condition begins failing simultaneously, begins the cascade of deterioration that will end in death, that might come quickly or might come slowly, but which will certainly come, which has always been coming, which Maurice has known about since he was 14 years old, sitting in a doctor's office in Toulouse, learning that his body carried transformation that would make his dreams impossible and his death inevitable. He settles in Chicago permanently, lives quietly in his book-filled apartment, maintains his friendship with Carl, who is also retired and lives nearby, who visits regularly, who remains the one constant in Maurice's life, the one relationship that has endured, the one person who stayed. And one day, though Maurice never knows this, never learns that his face will outlive him in ways he cannot imagine, a young animator named William Steig sees photographs of Maurice Tillet in a wrestling history book, studies the face, the massive brow ridge, the jutting jaw, the hands like clubs, the body that seems too large for the world it inhabits. Steig is working on character designs for a picture book about an ogre, and looking at Maurice's photographs, he finds his model, finds the visual reference that will become Shrek, finds the face that will be transformed into fairy tale, into children's entertainment, into billion-dollar franchise that will bring joy to millions while erasing completely the man whose tragedy inspired it, whose suffering became sanitized into story about acceptance and love and happy endings that Maurice himself was denied. Maurice dies on September 4th, 1954, age 60, of heart failure. Carl is beside him. The apartment is filled with books. His last words are in French, the language his mother taught him. Je suis fatigué. I'm tired. He wanted to be remembered as intelligent. He wanted to be seen as human. Instead, he became an ogre in a swamp. Maurice Tillet's grave sits in the Lithuanian National Cemetery in Chicago, a modest headstone bearing his name, the years of his life rendered as simple arithmetic, 1893 to 1954. 61 years, distilled into two numbers, separated by a dash that represents everything that happened between birth and death, all the suffering and small joys, and grinding loneliness, and brief moments of connection, and decades of being treated as spectacle compressed into a single horizontal line carved in stone that will outlast memory, that will remain long after everyone who knew Maurice has died, long after the last person who saw him wrestle has forgotten his face, long after his story has been buried beneath layers of sanitized narrative that transform tragedy into entertainment, that turn suffering into fairy tale, that make his pain profitable for everyone except Maurice himself. The headstone carries a single phrase that Carl Pagello insisted on adding when he paid for the burial, when he arranged the funeral that only a handful of people attended, when he performed the final acts of friendship for someone who had been his closest companion, his intellectual equal, his reminder that humanity exists in forms that don't fit expected patterns, that intelligence and gentleness and capacity for deep feeling have nothing to do with whether your face frightens children or makes adults uncomfortable, or triggers responses that evolutionary psychology can explain but cannot excuse, cannot justify, cannot transform into anything other than cruelty dressed in biological necessity. The phrase reads, "Beloved friend and scholar." Scholar, not wrestler, not champion, not the French angel, not the monster, not the spectacle. Scholar, because that is what Maurice wanted to be remembered as. What he claimed for himself even when the world insisted on defining him otherwise. What he maintained as his true identity, even when every door that would have allowed him to be scholar professionally remained closed, remained locked, remained impossible to open because no university would hire him, no law firm would employ him, no institution that required public interaction would permit someone who looked like Maurice to represent them, to speak for them, to be associated with them in ways that might make donors uncomfortable, that might make students uneasy, that might remind everyone that intelligence doesn't require a normal face, that brilliance can house itself in bodies that society has decided are monstrous. The grave is well maintained. Wrestling historians visit occasionally, leave flowers, take photographs for articles and books and documentaries about professional wrestling's golden age, about the characters who populated the sport when it was transitioning from legitimate athletic competition to choreographed entertainment, when men like Maurice could still win or lose based on actual ability, rather than on what promoters decided would generate maximum revenue, maximum spectacle, maximum return on investment in bodies that perform violence for crowds who pay to watch. But how many of these visitors know about the books Maurice read, the languages he spoke fluently, the philosophical conversations he held with Carl that ranged across centuries of intellectual history, across traditions and cultures and ways of thinking about fundamental questions that humans have asked since language developed sufficiently to articulate wonder, to express curiosity, to demand answers that the universe may not provide, but which the asking itself makes us human, makes us more than meat and bone and biological processes that eventually fail. How many of them know he wanted to be a lawyer? When children watch Shrek, they don't know they're looking at Maurice Tiller's face. When adults discuss the film's themes of acceptance and love and looking past surface appearance to recognize internal beauty, they don't reference the real person whose tragedy inspired the character's creation, whose suffering was transformed into entertainment that makes people feel good about themselves, that allows them to believe they would be like Fiona, that they would look past the monstrous exterior to recognize the good person underneath, that they would be different from all the people in Maurice's actual life who saw the monster and never looked deeper, who decided based purely on appearance that he wasn't worth knowing, wasn't worth loving, wasn't worth the effort required to overcome initial revulsion to discover the brilliant mind and gentle soul that his face concealed from everyone except the one person who bothered to look, who bothered to stay, who bothered to see Maurice as human rather than as horror. When DreamWorks marketed the film, they never mentioned Maurice, never acknowledged the human being whose appearance became the foundation for their billion-dollar franchise, never considered that perhaps the man whose face they borrowed, whose tragedy they sanitized, whose loneliness they transformed into happy ending that he never experienced, deserved recognition, deserved acknowledgement, deserved the simple courtesy of having his humanity recognized even in death, even decades after he could no longer be hurt by erasure, by appropriation, by the casual theft of his image to sell stories about acceptance to people who would never have accepted Maurice himself, who would have turned away, who would have been exactly like Celeste at the dance, who would have seen the face and fled despite all their professed beliefs about inner beauty, mattering more than appearance. This is what we lose when we transform real people into symbols, when we take someone's tragedy and sanitize it into entertainment, when we separate the face from the person who lived behind it, who suffered behind it, who died behind it, without ever receiving the love that fairy tales promise, that children's movies guarantee, that our stories insist everyone deserves, but which real life distributes according to rules that have everything to do with appearance, and very little to do with character or intelligence, or any of the qualities we claim to value when we're not being honest about what actually determines who receives love and who remains alone. Maurice Tillet was a real person. He suffered real loneliness. He achieved real success. He maintained real dignity in circumstances that would have broken lesser people, that would have turned anyone bitter, that would have justified rage and cruelty in all the responses that humans display when the world treats them as less than human. When society decides, based on appearance, that you don't deserve basic dignity, basic respect, basic recognition, that you matter. But when we remember him, if we remember him at all, we remember him as the man who inspired Shrek, as a curiosity, as an interesting historical footnote to a beloved film, as the face that became a fairy tale without ever acknowledging the person who lived with that face, who woke every morning and saw in the mirror not an ogre but himself, who died having been valued for his strength and feared for his appearance and loved by exactly one person who saw past the surface to recognize the brilliant gentleman that society insisted could not exist, that the world refused to acknowledge, that history has chosen to forget, except as the face that sold a fairy tale about acceptance to people who never had to practice it, who never had to look at Maurice and choose to stay, who never had to overcome their own revulsion to recognize his humanity. This is Maurice. Remember him.